Back in 301 AD, a Roman emperor named Diocletian did something extreme. He created a massive 32-chapter law that controlled the prices of more than 1,200 different items and services throughout the entire Roman Empire. We're talking about everything from bread to wagon parts, expensive silk to what stonemasons got paid. And if you broke these price rules, they'd execute you. Now, Diocletian wasn't some power-hungry dictator who just wanted to boss people around. He made this law because Rome's economy was falling apart. Prices were going crazy, and he honestly thought greedy merchants and businessmen were destroying everything. But here's the thing, he got it completely wrong. The merchants weren't creating the problem. They were just reacting to what was already happening. So what was the real issue? For about 100 years before this, Rome had been destroying their own money, cutting down the amount of silver in their coins to fund an empire that had gotten way too expensive. By 301 AD, coins that used to be almost pure silver 95% were down to barely 5% silver. Their currency was worthless, and these price controls were just Diocletian's last-ditch effort to keep everything from falling apart. Guess what happened? It completely failed. Less than 10 years later, they gave up on the price controls, and 100 years after that, the Western Roman Empire was gone. Now, here's what you need to understand. Rome didn't fall because barbarians invaded them. The invasions worked because Rome was already dead on the inside, and Rome died from the inside because their leaders completely missed a crucial moment, the exact point when the empire stopped making wealth and started just trying not to lose what they had. They missed it because when it happened, Rome still seemed incredibly powerful. Their armies were still feared. Their borders were still protected. People still used their money. Everything seemed totally fine, until one day it wasn't. Now jump ahead to August 4th, 1914. Britain is the unbeatable superpower of the entire planet. The British Empire covers 13 million square miles and rules over 412 million. People, that's almost 1 out of every 4 people alive. The British pound is what everyone uses for international business. London is where all the world's money flows through. British leaders think nobody can touch them. They've been the dominant force for more than 100 years. Their navy is bigger than the next 2 biggest navies put together. Their empire makes everything rubber, wheat, gold, you name it. Then World War I starts. And in just 4 years, Britain goes from being the world's biggest lender to being drowning in debt. By 1918, Britain owes America $4.7 billion. That's like owing over $100 billion in today's money. But here's what really matters. The war didn't cause Britain to decline. It just exposed a decline that was already happening behind the scenes. Britain had already peaked. The empire had already shifted from actually making things to just managing money from past success. The war just made everyone see what was already true. British leaders missed the turning point. They thought running an empire was still making them money when it was actually costing them more than it brought in. They thought their financial power was based on current strength when really it was just coasting on momentum from the past. By 1931, Britain gave up trying to back their money with gold. By 1945, the pound wasn't the world's main currency anymore. By 1956, the Suez Crisis showed that Britain couldn't do anything major without America saying it was okay. The empire dissolved not because someone invaded Britain, not because of one big disaster, but because they missed the moment, when the economic base holding up their power had already crumbled away. Now, let's look at the United States in 2026. The US dollar is still technically the world's main currency. American military strength is still unmatched if you just look at the numbers. The US economy is still one of the biggest on earth. Financial markets around the world still pay attention to what the Federal Reserve does. American tech companies still run most of the internet. Everything still seems fine, just like Rome seemed fine in 280 AD, just like Britain seemed fine in 1910, but there's a pattern that shows up at the top of every empire. Specific change that happens before anyone can see the decline coming. And that change happened in the United States many decades ago. Here's the pattern. Empires don't collapse because they stop being strong. They collapse because they switch from creating wealth to just taking it, from from actually producing valuable things to just managing money, from building stuff to turning everything into financial games. And they make this switch without even realizing it because all the obvious signs of power are still there. Rome missed it, Britain missed it, and the United States missed it too. And right now, in 2026, we're watching the consequences play out in front of our eyes. Let me show you the exact moment each empire missed, why they didn't see it, and why what's happening in America right now is the inevitable outcome of a change that happened 50 years ago. Rome's critical moment happened in 235 AD, and the warning was so obvious that Roman historians wrote about it at the time, but Roman leaders just ignored it. For centuries, Rome's strength came from one simple thing: they made more than they used. Roman farms fed the empire. Roman engineers built roads and buildings all across Europe. Roman factories created products that were sold throughout the known world. Roman mines dug up gold and silver that backed their money. The empire created real wealth. Military conquests added to that wealth by bringing productive new territories under Roman control. The system worked perfectly. But by 235 AD, something had changed. Rome was still militarily powerful. The borders were still defended. But look at what had shifted in how their economy worked. Roman manufacturing had dropped off. Why make things when you can just import them cheaper from your provinces using your strong currency? Pottery that used to be made in Italy was now coming from Gaul and North Africa. Fabric came from Egypt. Even food production had moved to the provinces. The Roman economy had become all about finance. Wealthy Romans didn't put money into businesses that made things. They invested in land, slaves, and lending money for interest. The goal wasn't creating new wealth, it was just collecting rent from things they already owned. Government income came more and more from taxes instead of from businesses the state owned. And those taxes were being collected from fewer and fewer people who actually made things, because production had moved to the provinces. Here's the trap Rome walked into. They had switched from an economy that makes things to an economy that manages money. But their expenses hadn't gone down. The army still needed paychecks. The government bureaucracy still needed funding. The borders still needed defending. So they did what every empire does at this stage. They started ruining their currency. In 235 AD, their denarius coin was still about half silver. By 268 AD, it was only 5% silver. By 301 AD, when Diocletian made those price control laws, it was basically just bronze with a thin coating of silver. Roman leaders missed the turning point. They thought their strong currency meant their economy was strong. They didn't realize the currency was strong because of what they'd built in the past, not what they were building now. By the time they noticed something was wrong, destroying their currency was the only option they had left. And once you start down that road, you never stop until the money becomes completely worthless. The Roman Empire didn't fall to barbarians in 235 AD. It didn't fall in 268 AD. It didn't even fall in 301 AD when Diocletian tried controlling all the prices. The official end came in 476 AD, but the empire was already dead at its peak. Leaders just couldn't see it because the external signs of power, the armies, the borders, the fact that people still used their currency all stayed in place even as the economic foundation rotted from the inside. Britain's critical moment came in 1870, and just like Rome, the warnings were documented but completely ignored. In 1870, Britain was the factory of the world. British manufacturing made up nearly 32% of all industrial production on the planet. British coal powered everything. British steel built railroads on every continent. British textiles clothed millions of people. British ships carried global trade. Britain's power was built on making things. They created products the world wanted, and they made them better and cheaper than anyone else could. But 1870 was the top of the mountain. And here's what changed after that. British industry stopped putting money into better production and started putting money into financial investments. Why upgrade your factory when you can invest in railways in Argentina and get guaranteed returns? Why develop new manufacturing methods when you can lend money to foreign governments at high interest? Why make things when you can just manage money? British money started flowing overseas not to build better production at home, but to earn financial returns abroad. Between 1870 and 1914, Britain invested more money in other countries than it invested in itself. On the surface, this looked like strength. Britain was so rich it could afford to fund other nations' development. London was the financial center of the entire world. The British pound was the universal currency everyone used, but underneath the surface, something had shifted. Britain was changing from an economy that makes things to an economy that handles money. Manufacturing was declining. Innovation was slowing down. Their ability to produce was being overtaken by Germany and the United States. By 1900, America had passed Britain in manufacturing output. By 1910, Germany was making more steel than Britain. Britain's share of global manufacturing had crashed from 32% in 1870, down to just 14% by 1930, but British leaders didn't notice because the pound was still strong. London was still the money capital. Britain still had the biggest empire. All the visible signs of power were still there. Then World War I started and the illusion shattered. Britain entered the war in August 1914 as the world's biggest creditor nation. Other countries owed Britain money. Britain left the war in November 1918 as a debtor nation owing billions to the United States. How did that happen in just 4 years? Because Britain's financial power was built on what they'd accomplished in the past, not on what they could actually produce in the present. When war required actual production ships, artillery shells, weapons, equipment, Britain couldn't make enough. They had to buy from America, and they had to borrow to pay for it. The war didn't cause Britain's decline. It just revealed that the decline had already happened. Britain had already switched from being a productive power to being a financial power. They just didn't notice until they suddenly needed production again. After the war, British leaders tried to restore the old system. In 1925, Winston Churchill, as the guy in charge of Britain's finances, returned Britain to backing their money with gold at the same exchange rate as before the war. He wanted to make the pound the global reserve currency again. It was a complete disaster. The pound was overvalued compared to what Britain could actually produce. British exports became too expensive to compete. Unemployment skyrocketed. By 1931, Britain gave up on the gold standard anyway. Churchill later said returning to gold at the old rate was the biggest mistake of his entire political career. But the real mistake wasn't the exchange rate. The real mistake was trying to maintain financial dominance after they'd already lost productive dominance. You can't be a financial superpower without being a productive superpower. Eventually, the currency reflects the actual economy, not the other way around. Now look at the United States in 2026 and watch the consequences of missing that same transition. America's moment, the turning point that got missed, came in 1971, and we're living through the final stages of that missed opportunity right now. In 1971, Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. For the first time ever, the world's reserve currency was backed by nothing except trust in the U.S. government. Why did Nixon do this? Because the U.S. was importing more than it exported, running trade deficits. Foreign countries were collecting dollars and they were starting to trade those dollars in for America's gold. U.S. gold reserves were draining away, so Nixon ended the conversion. At the time, this seemed like a power move. America was so dominant it could just change the rules of the entire global money system on its own. But here's what it really meant. The U.S. was switching from an economy that makes things to an economy that manages money. And that switch was happening because American manufacturing was becoming less competitive compared to factories in Germany and Japan. In 1970, U.S. manufacturing was 25% of the entire economy. Today, in 2026, it's barely 10% of the economy. The U.S. didn't stop being an economic power. It just shifted from making things to financing things. Look at what happened to American industry. In 1970, General Motors was the biggest company in America by revenue. They made cars. In 2026, the biggest companies by market value are Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon. They make software, design computer chips that get manufactured in Taiwan, run digital platforms, and manage logistics. There's nothing wrong with software and platforms, but here's the problem. You can't eat software. You can't build bridges and power plants with just code. You can't keep cities running with apps. You can't fight wars with financial derivatives. When Rome switched from production to finance, they could still import what they needed from the provinces using their strong currency. When Britain switched from production to finance, they could still import what they needed from the empire using the pound. The US could import what it needed from the world using the dollar. But that only works as long as the dollar stays the reserve currency. And reserve currency status only lasts as long as the world believes in American productive capacity. Here's where we are in 2026. U.S. national debt just passed $35 trillion. The annual deficit is now running over $2.5 trillion. The trade deficit in 2025 was more than $850 billion, meaning America consumed $850 billion more than it produced. How does this work? Because the dollar is still the reserve currency. Other countries still need dollars to do international business. So they buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which gives the U.S. government money to cover the deficit, which allows the U.S. to keep consuming more than it makes. It's a perfect system as long as the dollar stays the reserve currency. But look at what's happening right now in 2026. In 2001, the dollar made up 72% of global foreign exchange reserves. By the end of 2025, it dropped to 56%. That's a 16 percentage point drop in 24 years. But here's what's really alarming. The pace is speeding up. The dollar lost 2 full percentage points just in 2024 and 2025 combined. China is now settling 28% of its international transactions in yuan, up from 23% just 2 years ago. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan, rupees, and even digital currencies for oil sales. The BRICS nations just launched their alternative payment system in October 2025. It has already processing $47 billion in transactions every month. Central banks around the world bought 2,500 tons of gold in 2025, breaking the record from 2023. China's central bank just reported adding another 89 tons in just the first quarter of 2026. They not buying gold because it's a great investment. They rebuying gold because they reactively preparing for a world where the dollar isn't the universal reserve currency anymore. And if the dollar loses reserve status, the U.S. faces the same crisis Rome and Britain faced. The cost of maintaining the empire is more than the productive capacity to sustain it. The U.S. military budget is now $927 billion per year for fiscal 2026. The U.S. still maintains roughly 750 military bases in over 80 countries. The U.S. Navy still patrols shipping lanes around the world. The U.S. still promises military protection to dozens of nations. All of this is only affordable as long as the U.S. can print dollars and have other countries accept them. But look at what's happening in the Treasury market right now. In March 2026, we just saw the third Treasury auction failure in 18 months. The Treasury tried to sell $42 billion in 10-year bonds. The primary dealers, the banks that are required to buy if nobody else will had to absorb 31% of the auction because there weren't enough other buyers. That's not normal. In a healthy market, primary dealers absorb 10 to 15%. When they're forced to take 30%, it means the world's safest asset can't find buyers at the price being offered. The Federal Reserve had to quietly step in through emergency lending, providing $18 billion in overnight funding to help those banks finance what they'd bought. This is the Treasury market breaking down. Not might break down, is breaking down right now in 2026, and it's breaking because foreign buyers are walking away. China's Treasury holdings have fallen to $780 billion, down from over $1.1 trillion in 2021. Japan has been selling for 9 straight months as of March 2026 to defend their currency. Saudi Arabia's holdings dropped by $37 billion in 2025 alone. Who's replacing these buyers? Nobody. The Fed is doing quantitative tightening. They're selling, not buying. Domestic buyers can't absorb the volume, so interest rates have to rise to attract buyers. 10-year Treasury yields hit 4.8%. In February 2026, the highest since 2007, and here's the trap. At 4.8%, interest payments on $35 trillion in debt are $1.68 trillion per year. That's $1.68 trillion in government spending that creates nothing, no roads, no schools, no defense, no benefits, just interest to previous lenders. And it gets worse. Over the next 24 months, between now and early 2028, $11.7 trillion in existing Treasury debt reaches maturity and must be refinanced, plus another $5 trillion in new debt to cover deficits. The Treasury needs to sell $16.7 trillion in bonds over the next 2 years in a market where auctions are already failing, where foreign buyers are leaving, where interest rates are rising. This is the debt death spiral. It's the same pattern Rome entered in 235 AD, the same pattern Britain entered after World War I, and we're watching it happen in real time. Here's the pattern that connects all three empires. They make a specific transition at their peak, and that transition is always identical. They shift from creating wealth to extracting it. Instead of investing in making things, the elite invest in financial engineering. Instead of building things, they just manage money. Instead of creating, they collect rent. Rome's elite stopped investing in workshops and started investing in massive agricultural estates worked by slaves. They weren't creating new wealth, they were extracting rent from land. Britain's elite stopped investing in factories and started investing in foreign bonds and colonial ventures. They weren't creating new wealth, they were extracting returns from financial assets. America's elite stopped investing in manufacturing and started investing in stock buybacks, private equity, and financial derivatives. They're not creating new wealth, they're extracting value from things that already exist. Look at what happened just this quarter in early 2026. S&P 500 companies announced $312 billion in stock buybacks. Meanwhile, manufacturing investment was only $187 billion. American corporations are spending more money buying back their own stock than investing in actually making things. This is financialization in its final stage. And here's why this matters so much. When an economy switches from productive to extractive, it can keep up the appearance of wealth for decades through currency manipulation. Rome did it for 150 years through destroying their currency. Britain did it for 70 years through their empire and the pound's dominance. The U.S. has done it for 55 years through the dollar's reserve status. But eventually the currency reflects the productive reality, and when it does, the adjustment is catastrophic. Rome's currency went from trusted money to worthless metal in less than a century. Britain's pound went from global reserve currency to just a regional currency in less than 50 years. The dollar's transition is happening now. And it's happening faster than either previous example because information moves faster now, money moves faster, and alternatives exist that didn't exist before. When Rome's currency collapsed, there was no alternative empire to shift to. When Britain's pound lost reserve status, it took decades for the dollar to fully replace it. Today, in 2026, if the dollar loses reserve status, money can shift to yuan, euros, gold, or digital alternatives in hours. The collapse won't take 150 years like Rome. It won't take 50 years like Britain. We're watching it happen on a timeline measured in years. And just like Rome and Britain, American leaders are missing the endgame because they're looking at the wrong things. They look at stock market levels and think the economy is strong. The S&P 500 is still near all-time highs as of March 2026. But that's not strength. That's investors running from currency into any asset that might hold value. Rome's elite looked at grain shipments from Egypt and thought the empire was stable while the currency was collapsing. Britain's elite looked at how big their empire was on a map and thought they were secure while their ability to produce was eroding. They're all measuring symptoms of past dominance while missing the erosion of current capacity. Here's what American leaders should be watching, but aren't. The U.S. trade deficit in advanced technology products, the things America is supposed to dominate, hit $245 billion in 2025. The U.S. is running a massive trade deficit in the very sector where it claims to be the technology leader. U.S. manufacturing capacity utilization is at 76.8%, meaning even with a dramatically smaller manufacturing base, factories are running below capacity. There's no surge capacity for a crisis. If a real conflict breaks out, say over Taiwan, and the U.S. needs to rapidly produce weapons, vehicles, ships, there's no domestic capacity to do it. U.S. national debt is growing faster than the economy. In 2000, debt was 55% of GDP. Right now in 2026, it's 128% of GDP. Interest payments on that debt are projected to hit $1.7 trillion this fiscal year, more than defense spending, more than Medicare. This is the debt spiral. Once you're spending more on debt service than on productive investment, you're in managed decline. The only question is how long the currency holds up. And here's the mechanism that makes collapse inevitable. As your ability to produce declines, debt increases to maintain living standards. As debt increases, more currency must be created to service it. As currency is created, its value compared to real assets declines. As currency value declines, imports become more expensive. As imports become expensive, living standards decline. At that point, you're in the final stage, the choice between explicit default or currency destruction. Rome chose currency destruction through debasing their coins. Britain chose managed decline through devaluation and loss of reserve status. The U.S. is choosing the same path right now in 2026, and you can see it in Federal Reserve policy. At the last Federal Reserve meeting in March 2026, they kept interest rates unchanged despite clear signs of economic stress. Why? Because they can't raise rates further without triggering a government debt crisis. And they can't cut rates without bringing back inflation that's still running at 3.7%? They're trapped. And trapped central banks always choose the same option: print money and destroy currency value rather than allow outright default. They'll call it quantitative easing or emergency liquidity or whatever new term they invent. But what they're redoing is the same thing Diocletian did in 301 AD, trying to solve a production problem with a currency solution. It didn't work then. It's not working now. We're not at the beginning of this process. We're in the final stages. The signs are everywhere if you know how to read them. Look at what is happening in commercial real estate right now in 2026. Office building values in major cities have fallen 45% from 2019 peaks. But small and regional banks are still carrying these properties on their books at values from 2021 and 2022. Why haven't regulators forced them to mark these to current market prices? Because if they did, 280 banks would be technically insolvent based on the latest estimates from the FDIC. So regulators are allowing fake accounting to prevent a banking crisis. That's not stability. That's a controlled demolition in slow motion. Look at what's happening with corporate debt. 1.8 trillion in corporate bonds are maturing. In 2026 and 2027, companies that borrowed at 3% in 2020 are now refinancing at 8%. Moody's just reported that corporate default rates hit 4.2% in the first quarter of 2026, the highest level since 2009. Look at what's happening with the federal deficit. The Congressional Budget Office just revised their projection for fiscal 2026. The deficit is now forecast at $2.6 trillion, up from $2.1 trillion just 6 months ago. Every projection keeps getting worse. Look at what's happening with Social Security. As of January 2026, Social Security is now running a monthly deficit of $11 billion. The trust fund is being drained faster than projected. The depletion date has been moved up to 2032. Look at what's happening globally. The BRICS summit in July 2025 announced a common currency backed by a basket of commodities. The IMF just published a paper in February 2026 titled Preparing for a Multipolar Reserve System. Saudi Arabia signed a defense agreement with China in January 2026. These aren't warnings of what might happen. These are events happening right now. So who wins and who loses as this plays out through 2026, 2027, and 2028? Everyone holding dollar-denominated assets is losing. Your savings are losing purchasing power every month. Your bonds are losing value. Your pension that's promised in dollars is delivering checks that buy less. If you're counting on Social Security, you're getting your payment, but it's buying 12% less than it did 3 years ago. And that's accelerating. Workers whose wages are in dollars are losing. Your salary might have gotten a 3% raise, but real inflation, the actual increase in your cost of living, is running at 6 to 7%. You're working the same hours for money that buys less food, less energy, less housing. Small businesses operating on thin margins are dying. When your costs rise faster than you can raise prices, margins disappear. When consumers have less purchasing power, revenue falls. The number of small business bankruptcies in Q1 2026 was up 47% year over year. Middle-class families are being hollowed out. You have enough assets to lose something, but not enough to protect yourself. Your home equity looks stable on paper, but property taxes are rising while your actual purchasing power is falling. Your retirement accounts show numbers that look okay until you calculate what those numbers will actually buy. The government is losing control. They can print money, but they can't print trust. And right now, in early 2026, we're watching trust erode in real time. Treasury auction failures. Credit rating agencies issuing warnings. Foreign central banks diversifying their reserves. But some people are winning, and they're winning big. Those who positioned in hard assets before 2024 are winning. Productive farmland has maintained purchasing power. Energy infrastructure, oil wells, pipelines, power generation has maintained value. Physical commodities are surging. Those holding gold are winning. Gold hit $2,280 per ounce in March 2026. That's not because gold suddenly became more valuable. It's because the dollar is becoming less valuable. Central banks understand this. That's why they bought 2,500 tons in 2025. Major corporations with pricing power are winning. Apple just raised prices across their entire product line by 8%. ExxonMobil is generating record profits. If you're a company that can raise prices faster than your costs rise, you win in an inflationary environment. The globally diversified are winning. Assets in multiple currencies, multiple legal systems, multiple countries. When the dollar weakens, other holdings offset it. But here's the brutal truth. For most people reading this in 2026, it's already too late to fully protect yourself. The time to position was 2022, 2023, 2024. When Rome's currency crisis became undeniable, people rushed to trade silver for goods. But by then, goods were scarce and expensive. When Britain's pound crisis became clear, money fled to dollars. But by then, assets had already repriced. We're past the early warning phase, we're in the acceleration phase. The smart money positioned years ago. The institutional money is repositioning now. By the time this becomes obvious to everyone, the best positioning opportunities will be gone. And that's exactly where we are. Authorities are still saying everything is manageable. The Fed says they have tools to address challenges. The Treasury says debt is sustainable. Politicians say the economy is resilient. Just like Roman emperors said the currency was sound while destroying it. Just like British leaders said the empire was secure while bleeding gold reserves. Just like every authority at the peak of every empire that ever collapsed. They're not deliberately lying. They genuinely believe it. Or they believe they have no choice but to say it. Because they re-trapped by the same problem every empire faces at this stage, admitting the problem triggers the crisis they trying to prevent. If the Treasury admits the debt is unsustainable, Treasury auctions fail immediately. If the Fed admits they can't control inflation without crashing the economy, markets panic. If politicians admit Social Security is insolvent, retirees revolt. They keep saying everything is manageable right up until it isn't. The moment that matters, the transition from productive to extractive, from creation to management, from building to financializing, that moment happened in 1971 when the dollar left gold and became pure fiat. It accelerated in the 1980s and 1990s when manufacturing left for Asia. It became irreversible in 2008 when the response to the financial crisis was more financialization, not bringing back industry. We're now 55 years into this transition. Rome took 150 years from transition to collapse. Britain took 70 years. The US is tracking faster than either previous example because the modern financial system allows money to move faster and crises to spread faster. We're not at the beginning of this process, we're approaching the end. And in 2026, the evidence of the end is everywhere. When central banks globally are buying gold at record pace, they're preparing for dollar devaluation. When China is running alternative payment systems that processed $47 billion last month, they're preparing for dollar decline. When foreign holdings of Treasury bonds fell by $387 billion in 2025, they're preparing for the dollar to lose reserve status. These aren't theories, these are actions by sophisticated institutions with access to better information than almost anyone. And they're all preparing for the same thing. The moment Rome missed was when production left Italy for the provinces. The moment Britain missed was when production left Britain for Germany and America. The moment the US missed was when production left America for Asia, while thinking reserve currency status made that acceptable. It didn't. Reserve currency status is the result of productive dominance, not a substitute for it. And once productive dominance is lost, reserve currency status follows.